I'm Madeline Blair, and this is Unlocked, a show all about opening possibilities so that when you're hit with the unexpected, you have options from which to choose. My guest today is John Hovell. He's actually one of my favorite people to talk with. We're going to be talking about lessons that a rather important gentleman learned in his life in architecture, namely Frank Lloyd Wright. And we're going to talk about lessons we've learned. And I think there's going to be more in there too. But that's just a teaser to let you know that's what we're going to be talking about. At the end of the show, I always talk about a book that's had a big impact on my life. John's going to join me, and he's going to talk about one that has had an impact on him. So stay tuned. John is the co-founder and CEO of Stratactical. He's an winner of multiple awards, and he serves on several advisory boards. He's a speaker and an author, and what I like the most is that he's a practitioner. And that means that he can talk about concepts and frameworks that guide and inform his work. And by the way, he does that in plain English. But he can also speak from his experience. I asked him to return to Unlock because he's one of the most provocative guests I have had the pleasure of entertaining. And he doesn't wait. He doesn't wait for me to ask a question or for me to suggest a topic because he asks me questions, which I love. So without further ado, John Hovell, welcome to Unlocked.
Hello, Dr. Blair, or my good friend Madeline. Good to see you again. Thanks for the honor of re-invitation.
You are so welcome. I mentioned that we were going to talk about lessons. And I have to be honest, recently I went to visit one of Frank Lloyd Wright's famous houses. It's called Falling Water. It's in Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh, where he built this as a country house, a weekend resort kind of thing, retreat kind of thing, for a very wealthy family, the Kaufmans from Pittsburgh. It's an amazing house. Amazing in so many ways. The views are incredible. The spaces feel very different. You are always comfortable, even though it feels spacious. In other words, you feel as if you're wrapped up, and yet you have lots of room. It's a remarkable feat of engineering, and he did it disturbing the nature around it as little as possible, so that when you go into the living room, the hearth is actually the rocks from the land. And I don't mean they transported them there. They built it on that.
Nice.
So it's just an amazing thing. Anyway, why am I talking about Falling Water when I introduced you to John? Because what I'd like to talk today with John is the book that I just picked up there called 50 Lessons to Learn from Frank Lloyd Wright. And it's just amazing what someone as an architect can learn from their work. That when I read it, I said, I know exactly what that means in terms of a general work environment and the organization structure. So John has agreed to just plunge in and see what each of us thinks about these lessons. And the very first one I want us to talk about, John, I'm going to throw the ball to you, let you start. The lesson is break the box.
Okay. Break the box.
Yes.
And what does Frank say about break the box? Does he have a...
He does.
Yeah.
He talks about the fact that we tend to think that the building has to be square, that the room has to be square, or at least have straight angles. And he says, no, that doesn't have to happen that way. And the authors of this book say it very well. He said, We can explode our sense of who and where we are just by getting rid of the idea that space has to come packaged in a box. Break that container, and the world outside and in yourself opens up.
Yeah. A few things do jump out at me. One is it does fit right with what you opened with. I think I might be provocative already, Madeline. I don't mean to be, it just happens for me. I've become extra sensitive to violent language. And so break the box and explode the space. I get little chills in the back of my shoulders on what is it about either our attraction or our normalcy, is that a word, our willingness to use that kind of language. That's the first thing that jumps out at me. And I also noticed a nice contrast with when you were describing physically being at Waterfall. I think the words I heard you say were warm, wrapped, and spacious.
Yes.
So to me, maybe there is some kind of play between break, explode, warm, and wrapped. Is there anything there for you?
I completely empathize with that aspect that you said, that those violent words of break, for example, explode. And I'm thinking about that. And I think so much of those word selections come out of a desire to grab the attention of the reader in the case of a book, or grab the attention of a viewer if you're watching a commercial. And so much of that has come out of that kind of language. If you talk to marketers, they're very clear about getting to things that are forceful. It almost force you. I hadn't thought about that dimension of it. So I'm really happy that you provoked that in me.
Yeah. And so I wonder what other options there are for grabbing attention. In fact, even grab for me it's a subtle,
Yeah.
even a subtle thing there too.
Good.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
I was thinking, as I thought about that, since I didn't focus on the words themselves, I kept thinking, all right, in organizations, we create org charts. There are lots of boxes around. And sometimes those boxes can become remarkable barriers between organizations, between units within the organization. So much so that we even use the term silo. And I kept thinking about it. I said, okay, now if we're going to break through that or change that in some way to make it the organization more effective, okay, you're probably thinking that, oh, but we have to be in boxes, we have to be in those little organization structures. But the real strength of an organization is how the information and knowledge flows among the people within the organization. So how can you, even in that kind of structure, how can you allow that flow to happen between them? And one of the things that occurs to me is, why not invite someone from that other unit to maybe a staff meeting that you're having in your area, and ask that person not to say anything that would be difficult for them, or difficult, let's leave it at that. Rather, ask that person, would you come and talk about a project that you did that you really found very satisfying, you were very proud of because you overcame something or you achieved something you didn't anticipate? People love to talk about those kinds of things. They don't hesitate to come in and talk about that sort of thing. And in that process, your staff is hearing the kinds of things the other unit is doing, and you're hearing them in the most positive light because they're talking about their achievements and how they did it. And invariably, when you have that kind of setting, a conversation begins. People ask questions, and then it's back and forth. And suddenly that flow of knowledge is going both ways. So in a way, it's a simple way to allow that flow of knowledge across and between and among the boxes. So that's what came to my mind.
Yeah, amazing. Because for me, the architecture side is something I enjoy. Architecture when I'm privileged and fortunate enough to travel around. Architecture, food, people, music, these are things I'm drawn to. But yeah, I have not read much Frank Lloyd Wright or know much about architecture. So yes, if we bring it into the organizational side, now I can step into my supposed experience, the lived stories I've had. Yeah, I guess without going too much into labels, I'm definitely hearing knowledge management, organization development, and even a light touch of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are the
Yes.
spaces that we play in. So yeah, the flow and the structure, for sure, knowledge flow, information flow fits right into those entire fields of
Mhm.
information management, knowledge management, and all the practices we have there. And then the talk about silos and what was your word? Inviting across units. To me, as like in the practice of knowledge management, we have processes, we have experiences, we have, dare I say, labels for those, right? So the first one that came to mind was that sounds like a peer assist.
Yeah.
And the beauty of a peer assist is a category of approaches, right? There's not one peer assist. In fact, I would dare say there are limitless ways to run a peer assist. I happen to have two or three favorites that I go to first, which sounded very similar to what you talk about. One is called a home and away peer assist, which is just like sports. If you're familiar with professional teams
Yeah.
that travel from city to city, same thing. So in a home and away peer assist, the home team designs what they want to learn, what they want to ask, what they want to talk about, and they invite the away team to come visit them. Right. So there's a power dynamic, there's a bit of control and structure in the conversation led by the home team. But the agreement is then the home team will become the away team and travel over to the home of it. Now, it might be physical travel, but of course, these days it's all virtual anyway. But there is still like that dynamic, that conversational feel of which team designed this 30 minutes or this 60 minutes or longer. And that home and away is just one example of a way to run a peer assist. And yeah, over the years, I've had very good luck with designing, facilitating, running, experiencing peer assists, if that's a fair label to use.
What comes to mind when you say peer assist, I generally think of that as a situation where you have a challenge in front of you and you
Mhm.
invite peers in to explore it with you. The example that I gave was where it was actually had been achieved. You brought the person in, so they just talked about their achievement. But of course, you still learn things that can you take home
Mm.
to resolve some of your own challenges. But I'd like this aspect of acknowledging that there's a home and an away. I like that, and it's not perfectly neutral, but gets away from the language normally used in organizations, like you're in operations and I'm in admin, or you're in finance and I'm in marketing. So it shifts that.
Yeah, yeah, different language, different, almost different notion of why we're together, the purpose.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that you do mention because when I think of project-based knowledge management, the beginning, the middle, and the end of a project, I tend to think of peer assists, one or two or three of them at the beginning of the project. Yeah, I
Mhm.
love the way you mentioned more of the achievement, the past, because in the project-based knowledge management, you've got peer assist at the beginning, just one or two, then you have after action reviews, the
Right.
whole what just happened on that recent action over and over throughout the life of the project. And then I guess when I hear you talking about like the past or the completed achievement, I tend to go to the whole notion of a retrospect, some kind of technique
Mhm.
for looking back at the life of the
Yes.
project. And all of that is, I guess, what we call project-based
Mhm.
knowledge management.
What calls to mind as we're talking about this is Ed Hoffman has often described this to me as how they brought together their project managers from across NASA.
Yep.
And all they did was tell stories of their particular projects. So there was not the overt intention that they were going to, that the other people listening would give them advice as an empiricist, but simply that they would learn. And he said that they were wildly successful because you're asking people to talk about things that they accomplished. So there's no threat. And yet, as soon as that the barriers have dropped, then people begin to go back and forth, and you do get what you would think of more as empiricists. So they're sharing how they solve things and why. Yeah.
Yeah, NASA does amazing knowledge management, right? It's Ed Hoffman, Ed Rogers, Gene Holm, Barbara Phillip, like so many great, Ian Moore. I'm not even getting to. Apologies to those. Knowledge management at NASA. The other thing they're known for, similar to their peer assists and their sharings, is I'm sure you're familiar with their fail fests, where you talk about the barriers coming down. NASA is also known for getting together and, as is often quite difficult to do inside organizations, talking about their biggest mistakes,
Yes.
creating an environment of
Yeah.
psychological safety and really courage to
Oh my goodness.
own,
Yes.
here's what went on for me, and I may or may not be proud of this, and hopefully I learned something, but it's now out in the middle for us all to learn from. We'll call
Mm.
them mistakes, or blips, maybe is a good word.
I really the phrase fail fast. That's one of, was it, I can never
Moynihan?
remember his name, the famous head of GE. I think that was one of his.
Was it Jack Welch?
Welch, yes. He would rather people fail fast because you learn in those situations and don't sit on a problem because it will only fester. As we're talking, I'm looking at the next lesson that Wright has in his book. And this is going to be more fun for you, I think.
Okay.
Maybe not. We'll see. It's called Let Nature Inspire You.
Okay.
Now, I have to tell you, I haven't thought about this one as
Sure.
much as I thought about the breaking the box, but at least this one has no violent language in it. Just let nature inspire you.
Both, to me, Break the Box and Let Nature Inspire You have an underpinning of creativity to them. Is that just me? Do you feel that too?
Oh, no, absolutely. These are opening the possibility to creativity. That's what I call it.
Open possibilities. So I wonder, pros and cons of opening possibilities. Here's what's coming up for me now. We're so fortunate to be inside organizations and doing many different facilitations. And I noticed my bias towards opening possibilities, towards emergence, towards co-creation, right? Things that emerge and then we work with what pops up. How I'm speaking right now, totally unplanned. This is popping up for me. I've learned over the years that there are quite a percentage of people that not only mentally don't want to work unstructured, emotionally, you know what, like, it's easy to get overwhelmed by opening possibilities. It's easy to get overwhelmed by break the box, be inspired by nature. No, I would rather just tell me what to do and I'll get that done. So that's been a balance that's been hard for me to learn, quite frankly, to partner with, I guess I would almost call it structured, unstructured. That's resonating at all?
Structured, unstructured. I actually read this particular lesson from Wright somewhat differently. Because when I think about nature, I think about that as the environment in which we live, an environment that is supportive of us. That's oxygen in the air. It recycles the water that we need on an ongoing basis. It takes care of all the trash and, well, the natural trash that it absorbs it and puts that food back into the ground so that the earth can continue to support us. So when I think about it from that perspective, I think about the culture of an organization. So when you let the culture inspire you, it's different. You can say, I know that when I am in our unit, I'm in a division. When I'm in my division, I really feel like I can ask any question. But when I have to present to the board, I can't do it because it's a different environment. And that's what's going through my head when I think of nature as the environment. That oftentimes in business, we find ourselves in a difficult environment. So how do we bring our nature into those kinds of settings? How do I, when I'm sitting at the board and I want to ask them a question, how can I phrase it so that I'm not afraid because I know that the question is not adversarial. For example, you may wonder why they're making a particular policy decision. I won't say what the policy is, just a policy decision. And you feel strongly that they haven't thought through the implications. Now, what I would, if I weren't afraid, I would say, have you thought about the implications of this policy? You would never say that to a board. So how do we bring my nature into that? And I might ask, when I think about that particular policy, I consider what it might mean to new mothers. Have you thought about that? So that it would be, the onus would be on me that I have thought about the implication, not them, and that they would then have suddenly a fresh or a new perspective on their policy without me saying, you haven't thought about this. So that's what's coming to my mind. It's not very well formed, but that's what my thinking is when I think of being inspired by nature.
There's so much there. So back where supportive is what really stuck with me at the beginning. And now as you're shifting over to me, blame and shame, which in psychotherapy is something we're hyper aware of.
Yeah.
Who's blaming who? Is there shame? Do we feel ashamed? So yeah, the language, the conversational process of blame and shame. And then we can get into, because I know we're trying to stay a little bit towards organizations, power structure, hierarchical, not every organization, but with great regularity, most organizations are still hierarchies. So you have a defined and undefined power structure at play. So it can almost be an indirect power that's happening. So the supportive really intrigued me though at the very beginning. Because the first thought for me was structured, unstructured, and I loved going back to then supportive, unsupportive. I like that the first thought that came up for me was structured, unstructured, and how you came from a different, I could almost imagine a 2x2, a left and a right and an up and down of unsupport to support and structure versus unstructure. I bet there's 4 boxes there that would be fun to create and see what comes out of those. And then, yeah, I'm still trying to tie to break the box, let nature inspire you, supportive, unsupportive. And yeah, the thought is not fully formed for me yet. This is all emergent. There was something I was listening to you, so I had a thought that I've lost. Something about the supportive, unsupportive side. All I wanted to say was this simple, slightly abstract thing. I think support to some people can look like 1 or 2 things. And those 1 or 2 things, your words here, okay, I think I can bring this together with what you were just saying. I think some cultures in the world would rather you say, have you ever thought of the implications of this?
Yes.
There are cultures that would much prefer that, and that would be supportive to them.
Yes.
Versus if you said, little old me, I'm thinking about mothers and I'm really worried about them, and let me go think about them and come back to you. That would feel supportive to some and very unsupportive to others. Yeah, there is something about the relationship, the in-between that, how do you know? How do you know what's structured, unstructured? How do you know what's supportive, unsupportive? Without either checking in or at least being curious about it.
John, that's a great insight because you're absolutely correct. There are literally cultures where I remember when I was teaching in international groups, and there were students who would ask very forceful questions, and to them that was just perfectly natural. And then there were students who would ask no questions because in their culture, to even ask a question of the professor would be an insult. So you're absolutely right. It's another dimension that you have to think about. Yeah.
What does Frank Lloyd Wright have to say about?
Let's see if I can find something. Organic architecture meant not so much copying the forms of nature, nor disappearing into the landscape, but taking inspiration from the principles at work in the natural world and making those hidden forces evident in the world human beings make for themselves. So I think that one of the examples that comes to mind as I'm thinking about that is that in the landscape, one of the principles of a natural world the colors in the natural world play a real role. The green of a forest is very calming, and it allows lots of movement. And within that, there may be a spark of color where a flower is saying, please come and pollinate me. So there's the color is actually operational. He would be thinking about the colors that he would choose. I remember when I was going through this tour of Falling Water, the docent described that beautiful, almost skin color that you saw on the major portions of the building. Here, I'll bring it up again just so people can see it. What looks like a buff color. That is actually the underside of, whoops, excuse me, there, that's what I want to remember. It was actually the underside of the rhododendrons in the forest. He looked at the underside, and there you could see that color, and so he reflected that in his building.
Yeah, one skin color, one tone. Several things popped up for me there too. Hidden and what's evident in organization development. I don't know if this is helpful or supportive for people. The labels we use there are overt and covert.
Yes.
So in organizations, you have overt structures, you have overt policies, you have information that's been written down, and then you often have covert knowledge, covert experience, covert, dare I say, operations. How things are getting done. Some people would just say for real or in real life. That's quite different from what's going on. And I'm sure in nature, there are things just like that too. It's a little bit inappropriate, but I remember watching a video on Instagram recently where it was funny to me. I hope it's funny to others, where this person said, I just want to relax. And so I'm going to go out into nature. And they had made up all these sounds that when they walked out into nature, they overplayed the sounds of the pollination you were talking about and what that must feel like to the birds and the bees. And slightly inappropriate, maybe funny. And I think that's a little bit covert. I'm not sure that's always audible to us as we walk around outside.
No. I live on a farm, so I'm constantly aware of all the pollinating that goes on. But the loudest is done by the hummingbirds. You hear this incredible buzz of their wings.
We're lucky to have one hummingbird in our back garden here. It's a treat. It's only
It is
like
a
once
treat.
a week I see it.
It is a treat. Yeah. And when they get used to you, they actually come very close. They'll even see if something that you're wearing is red. They'll test it.
I have this big hibiscus plant, big red flowers, and that's the one that they come to. Yep.
Yeah.
And I could be very wrong on this. I tend to think of nature as emergent, as continuous improvement, small changes that sometimes lead to big changes, but often lead to steps towards change. I think it's relatively rare in nature. Or I guess, again, back to violence where we started. I guess if there's an earthquake, that could be a violent, natural change. So anyway, the labels or the words, the concepts that popped up for me there were transitional change and transformational change.
Yeah.
And how there are times and moments where a continuous improvement, it's evolution and revolution, I think are the other words we heard years ago. Right? That just the human intellect being able to discern, is this a transitional change? Is this a transformational change? Is it both? How do we work with what's in front of us right now?
What comes to my mind as you talk about that is the fear that people often feel when they know that a change is going to happen.
Yeah.
I've seen organizations and units that have actually frozen. They just couldn't act at all because of the fear of what might happen. But when you introduce very small changes, people just adjust. I guess it's because they have the time to adjust to it. Yeah.
There's a roundabout in the UK called the Magic Roundabout. You may have heard of it or been to it before. And it's one of these major roundabout in the middle, and then 6 or 8 roundabouts around the outside of that, and then 4 more roundabouts around each one of those. And so if you just stumble upon it in your car and you've never even done a roundabout, let alone multiple roundabouts, the story they usually tell about that one is human ingenuity to basically just do it right or wrong, as if there is a right or wrong, and then work with all the other stuff moving around you at that moment. I was supposed to go right around this roundabout, but I went left and someone else is coming. Oh, and now you just, you slow down and you make it
Yeah.
work. The
You make it
fear
work.
side, I love that you bring the emotion stuff too. Fear could absolutely be there. I also wonder anxiety and paranoia could be there. Paranoia would probably be a step further, but at least some anxiety is potential with relation to that fear. And then I also heard if they, I can't remember your exact word, but fight, flight, freeze,
Freeze.
appease.
Yeah.
So it could be not only individuals, but groups can be behaving in a
Yes.
fight, flight, freeze, appease kind of
Yes.
way. And then again, supportive, unsupportive. Maybe it is supportive to be in a freeze mode. Our body needs to process and hold on to and work with and integrate what's going on for us in that moment. Freeze is the healthiest. Although from the outside, it probably looks like you're doing nothing. You can't handle this.
Yes.
We need more skilled people here.
Yeah.
Maybe it is like the being open to both, I think, is the
Open
point.
to both. Very interesting. Very interesting. I love this. I never thought about it from the perspective of the organizational issue where sometimes it's necessary to do nothing. And yet, how often have we said to not make a decision is to make a decision?
Exactly.
And yet,
we'll let time make the decision.
Yeah.
We'll just wait.
Yeah. John, I think we should move to another one of these lessons. One that I think, in a way, flows naturally from what we've been talking about. This is one somewhat later in the book. It's called Design for Resilience. Now, let me give you a little background. Well, first of all, of course, I love it because I believe in designing our lives around resilience and becoming more resilient. But the reason they use that here with Frank Lloyd Wright is that he actually designed in 1916 a hotel in Tokyo, which survived the 1923 earthquake with very little damage. And it goes on to say that Wright was no expert on earthquake resilient design, but he was willing to learn from what had worked in the past. And in the case of Japan, it was keeping buildings low and weaving them together with horizontal and vertical walls that intersected and braced each other. I just love this. It's just amazing. I keep thinking about this in terms of what it means to our lives. Okay, so that's why he said designed for resilience. Now, when I think of this, of course, I'm thinking about the work that I've done on resilience. How do you prepare yourself so that when you're hit with the unexpected, you don't freeze, as we talked about earlier? You're actually able to see options in front of you and make a choice as to how you want to move on. But I would rather pass the ball to you and let you talk about this a little bit more from your perspective.
Let's go back and forth too. Yeah, Paul Strong talked about resilient children, and I remember grit was one of the takeaways from that book. I also think of Dr. Linda Hoops, who's dedicated her life to the topic and the notion of resilience. And so I learned a lot from her. It's near and dear to my heart and my body when I think of the concept of resilience. And I love design for resilience, also maybe just living resiliently. My grandfather contracted the 1918 flu when he was 2 years old and was lucky to survive.
Yeah.
And then I had pneumonia when I was 2 years old and was lucky to survive. So there is something like almost a nature nurture of being of resilient body. The other thing that pops up for me is similar but different. I hope expands it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. Kolb, Kolb, has his experiential learning theory where he talks about, let me see if I have it memorized, concrete experience, which to me reminds me of nature, right? There's something that happens, shared reality between us. Then maybe, if you're up for it, reflective observation, I think is the word he uses, to get into your head a little bit, maybe into your body, but what do I notice about what just happened? And then, I would dare say, really get into your head and your body. Abstract conceptualization is his label or his word for, okay, so here's what happened. Here's what I noticed, my biases, my judgments, my curiosities, my fears about what happened. And now step back, right? What do we call it in human systems design? It's fold and unfold, unfold, and try and come up with a big, I was taught grand theory. What's my grand theory about this experience that just happened? And then to close the loop, you move into active experimentation. Go try something, which then creates a concrete experience for yourself and for others. So it's a experiential learning cycle to me, which reminds
Mhm.
me of everything we've been talking about here. Does that spark anything for you?
It does. Oftentimes, when I work with a group, especially if they've just finished a big project, it's almost a cliche to say, okay, what are lessons that we learned? And I remember early on when people were thinking about how do we capture this great knowledge, and they would often put these things into little databases and say, the lesson that we learned was never cross the street when the light is red.
Yep.
We learned after a while, though, that just capturing that part of it was not enough. You needed the context of that lesson before you really understood what it really meant. There was a wonderful example of when I was working at the World Bank where they wanted to do a project in a country. And they said, we're going to put up big posters on the walls in the city and it should work. And then everybody will know this is happening, et cetera, et cetera. And there was someone on the team who said, it won't work. It won't work. They never pursued why that person said it wouldn't work until the day that they put the posters up and the monsoon came and washed them away. So it was an interesting double lesson first.
Yep.
Yeah.
In knowledge management, in my experience in recent history, you're right. Late 90s, early 2000s, lessons learned databases, very popular. Chris Collison created a landscape for knowledge management of all the different types of areas. And he very cutely, funny, he created an area of the KM landscape and he called it the lessons learned graveyard. And he meant two things by that. He meant lessons learned as a process should go away, but he more gently meant most lessons are put into the graveyard and sadly rarely visited. So nowadays, in the last, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, the language I've been hearing is 4 levels of lessons learned. So not even calling them lessons learned anymore, or calling lessons learned a category, 4 different levels of it. And really quickly, level 1 is lessons documented, which is what I hear in your story there. It's
Yeah.
don't pretend like anybody's going to learn this. Don't pretend like anybody's going to use it. It's a documented lesson. It's put into SharePoint, put into a file. Lessons documented, level 1. Level 2 is lessons shared. That's really the story I hear from you. They tried to put it on a poster and people may have seen it or it may have gotten washed away or people may have disagreed with it. But at least there was an effort to communicate out that particular lesson. There are techniques for documenting lessons. There are techniques for sharing lessons. Level 3, underneath this category of lessons learned, is lessons applied, which happens to be one of my favorites. That's the one I really do have some luck with inside organizations. The approach we use there is called case-based learning.
Yeah.
Several organizations have gotten very skilled at writing cases, creating learning environments, using the Kolb experiential learning approach so that you re-experience and re-feel in your body and in the group the lesson that was supposedly learned, as opposed to reading about it or finding it or discovering it or having it told to you. You apply it. And then level 4 is the one that is, of course, the most challenging. Lessons practiced, which is where we're not going to wait. It's back to, I guess we talked about fail fast. We're not going to wait for this lesson to be over. We're going to, in real time, practice. What are we learning? What's working? What's not working? That type of knowledge flow, that type of feedback loops that are in this moment as we're experiencing the lesson, as opposed to a day, a week, a month, a decade later. Lessons practiced. 4th level of lessons learned.
I really like that structure, especially when you got to the 4th one, which is practice. Because in my work, I always say to people, you do these practices, because I always say that the practice is not for the purpose of perfecting the practice. It's a practice that's used for a goal that's out somewhere else. It's a very different way to think of a practice. And here, what I'm hearing is, let's practice it, and in its application and in its practice, you continue and go back and start sharing what you learned, and etc. So it becomes this continuous cycle.
I'm forgetting who said it, but it's reminding me so much of leadership is not a position. Leadership is a practice.
Yes.
And trying to shift that mindset
Yes.
from
Yeah.
hierarchical roles and that type of power structure versus a leadership as a potential option.
Yep. Just recently, I had the pleasure of listening to Steve Denning, who was talking about leadership, and he sees leadership as a subset of management, which, if you think about it as a practice, it is indeed a practice within management. I really enjoyed listening to him on that because it suddenly put leadership in a less exalted position. Yeah, just all right. Anything else on this particular one, this design for resilience?
Design for resilience. Yeah, I just like the concept of resilience. It is the word design that jumps out at me too. Part of me, as you know about me, I would want to gently challenge. Are you designing or is it being designed? What is your role in the design effort?
That's right. Well, I
just
can tell you,
watching for power and control again.
I often bring in teens on issues and projects because teenagers see things very differently, and it makes it more creative. And when you have that aspect of creativity, then when you're hit with the unexpected, you may have 3 options in front of you, but your creative abilities may actually find a fourth, and you can choose to move on, and that makes you more resilient. So those are some things that come to my mind.
There are 16 well-vetted, well-tested knowledge transfer and knowledge retention processes for inside organizations. That's where my mind is headed off towards now. So without getting into any of those, most of the intent there is to ensure unique and critical knowledge is not lost due to retirements, is very common at the time of this recording. Or said more generically, ensure unique and critical knowledge is kept in organizational memory, regardless if you have multiple roles or enough resources. The entire process is designed so that we operate, communicate, and deliver in a resilient way. I guess you could almost call it knowledge resilience, but we've typically called it knowledge transfer.
Knowledge retention is a word that I often think of. I've designed a couple of processes around that.
Oh, great. Let's add it to the 16.
To me, it's one of the critical things that makes an organization more resilient, that you retain the knowledge that you need, and it's there and available to people who need it. We've covered only 3 of his 50 lessons, but wow, what a rich conversation this has been, John. I think it's about time that we shift. Let me give you a chance to say any final thoughts on these discussions around these lessons, and then let's talk about the books that have had impact on our lives.
Sure. What's present for me is I enjoy back to Kolb, the abstract conceptualization, or said differently, looking for patterns and speaking to the patterns and exploring those things. And yeah, again, I wouldn't have thought of applying Frank Lloyd Wright or architecture learnings to organizations or to consulting or my life, your life, our relationship, that kind of thing. And yeah, I do. I enjoy that as the takeaway of whatever you're open to. You talked about bringing in teenagers, right? Like, how can you, Harold Jarkey talks about personal knowledge management. He maybe uses a different label these days, but he talks about seek, sense, share. And to me, that's maybe the takeaway of what we've been doing this time is seeking. We're seeking interesting perspectives, seeking different perspectives. We're not just saying we're curious, we are bringing our bodies to a curious state. It's not just a word, it's an actual intention, it's an effort to do that kind of seeking, let alone sense making and sharing as all part of it. Yeah, I appreciate the other views, a book to bring in a perspective. Yeah.
Okay. I love that. Seek, sense, and share. Because, really good. Really good. Okay. I have to talk about this book that I've been pulling these quotes from. So I won't talk about it long because we've just spent 45 minutes talking about some of the pieces in depth. What was remarkable to me was that I read the title, 50 Lessons to Learn from Frank Lloyd Wright. And I knew from just the title alone that I would gain something from it. And I couldn't even open the book in the store because it was wrapped in shrink wrap. And I suppose I could have peeled it off.
Always
I
an
said,
option. Yeah.
it was always an option. That's right. But I felt the title was enough. And very rarely for me is a title enough for me to be compelled to purchase the book. What happened was when I got it, that I was completely, what's the right word? Rewarded for my intuitive purchase, because the lessons that are listed here, every one of them spoke to me in some way. And the amount of text that's written about each of them is very small. It's less than a page. What the book is filled with are images and pictures that illustrate the lesson as well. Here's one that says that, what is it called? What is it? I'll get it. Make the room glow. And there are pictures of windows high up that literally bring in the light and positioned so that they reflect off of walls and floors and things like that. A remarkable book. I'm not sure everybody would find it as exciting as I do, but I'm an artist as well. I work with, in my case, my medium is fabric. So for me, anything that creates something material is interesting to me. And this has been doubly impactful because I can relate it also to the work that I do with organizations and with individuals. 50 Lessons to Learn from Frank Lloyd Wright by Aaron Betsky, Betsky, and Gideon Fink Shapiro.
Certainly workplace, workspace design has been a hot topic for years, right? More collaborative spaces, more open spaces, and then all the pushback that comes from those. Do you have offices? Do you have closed doors? What do your conference rooms look like? What's in the middle of the room? What's on the outside of the building? How much natural light? How open and closed, and right? How natural plants and smells and all of that is, colors. That's certainly a hot topic inside organizations, or was a few years ago anyway.
It was a few years ago. That's right. It was finally a recognition that we are influenced by the spaces that we live in. Whenever you go into, say, a cathedral, one of the things that inspires you is that the ceiling is extremely high. That's the key. So we are influenced by our spaces.
Which, of course, is by design.
By design. That's right.
And the acoustics are then affected by, it becomes a whole complexity, moving parts.
Exactly. So, John, what's your book?
Yeah, so I've got several I've got a long desk here, lucky to have, and I've got a few over here, but the one that is right in front of me, so admittedly it's some recency bias, lucky to have shelves of books over there, OD, conversational leadership, knowledge management, knowledge transfer, all kinds of different ones. But the one that is right in front of me right now is called Body Process by Dr. James I. Kepner, Kepner, with a foreword by Dr. Joe Zinker, Zinker. These are quite famous, highly respected, well-known people in the field of Gestalt Psychotherapy. And what also comes with this book for me is it was gifted to me by a person near and dear to my heart. So there's an emotional tie to the book as much as there is the beauty and the thoughtfulness of the words inside. I guess.
John, before you go on, I want you to define this Gestalt for people.
Sure. Okay. So that's a tricky one too. Okay. So Gestalt is a German word, and as translated to English best we can, it means whole. It means shape. We extend it a little bit to say things like the sum of the parts is different from the whole. That kind of language, that's very Gestalt. Another thing that's very Gestalt, there's so many things, so it's actually hard to describe, but if you've ever seen any of those pictures where if you look at it one way and then you are told to look at it differently, or somehow your mind says look at the same exact picture differently, and you see something fundamentally different, That's also very Gestalt.
Okay.
The main theory in my training of Gestalt is called the cycle of experience. It's not worth going through all the steps, but notice what I do with my finger. It's a cycle. It's a circle of
Mm.
my favorite part, if there is such a thing as a favorite. The sort of the bottom of the circle is called the fertile void, which means your body, your mind, your heart is in a space where, back to gardening and space, anything can grow. You're open to the next figure. Whereas many people that love Gestalt love that when they find it, they say, wow, this reflects for me how I've been living my life. And dare I say, some of the pain or tension or trauma that was unresolved. I didn't close, it got stuck somewhere in the cycle of experience. Gestalt helped me get back to the fertile void, get to that fertile open space for the next thing to emerge in that moment. So that's Gestalt. There's so much more, but that's part of Gestalt. And so body process, this book would be one, is your physical body in the fertile void, is a lot of what this book is talking about. I also just saw on Instagram recently, because Instagram is always listening and then producing things back for you that you were talking about. And so one of the things it said something about, if you're feeling tired, don't try to take medicines or not sleep. Listen to your body, because your body is processing things that your mind can't.
Yes.
So if you're feeling stomach hurts, knees hurt, elbows hurt, back hurts, you're tired, you're sad, you're crying, your physical body is doing the process that you probably think your mind should do. And that's a lot of things that are in this one. If I'd love to get your thoughts on some of these.
I will share one.
Sure.
This aspect of listening to your body. I'm trying to think how many years ago it was. 23 years ago. I ended up in a wheelchair because I had ignored the pain in my body. And I swore that if I could ever get out of that wheelchair, I would do whatever it took to take care of the body so I wouldn't have to go back into it. And after 2 months, we got me out of it. And I have been on Pilates, doing Pilates ever since. So it was a dreadful example of having to finally hear it. But now my life is entirely different, because it's not, yes, Pilates takes care of the body, but I'm also much more attuned to every small shift in my body. Yeah, makes a difference.
It does. That reminds me a little bit of one of the takeaways I have from the book so far is the disowned self. It's such simple, to me, standard English language to say something like, my stomach hurts.
Yeah.
Which is simple, and it's just what we do, and we've gotten used to. We've become numb to. So your stomach is an object, as if it's outside your body, as if it's not you, as opposed to, here in this area, I sense this, which would be very strange English language to use. But that's rather than separating and, dare I say, resisting what's going on, it's the integration.
It's the integration.
The embodying, it's the holding on to, here's the experience that this consciousness is having. And it does, it shifts. It brings it.
One of the things that comes to my mind when you say that, we often talk about this being aware of the body when it's a problem. But for me, I discovered that when I see a child, especially an infant, there's this welling of warmth that I feel literally in my body. And now I know that's just an acknowledgement of the body saying, yeah, this is important. This you really find precious. Yeah.
Which brings us all the way back to where we started with Falling Water, right? Is the name of Frank Lloyd's house. And the warmth you felt in there, that's a body awareness. Same thing as the children being around. And I just wonder what the world would look like if I myself practiced body process, body awareness. What comes up for me now in this moment is dancing. I wish I danced more. I wish I embraced. What's the old extreme you've heard? We're not just brains on sticks. So I feel ashamed of my own dancing capabilities, and yet I very much want the practice of being in my full body.
Just close the door and dance for yourself.
It might be my plan. It was already my thought this morning, yes.
Speaking of dancing, it has been wonderful dancing with you this morning.
Thank you for the lovely dance.
Oh, it's excellent. As always, John, you are provocative, and yet it's very comfortable to talk and explore new avenues with you. So thank you again for your generous offer to be with
Happy to
you.
be here and maybe see you again someday soon right here.
Indeed. Wow. If you would like to explore some of this with me, you know that you can just send me an email to Madeline@MadelineBlair.com. I spend a lot of time talking to people on the phone, and I would welcome that conversation. I want to thank you again for joining me today. And if there's anything that you learned from today, a simple insight, share it with us on social media. And if you're watching on YouTube, click the like button. Better yet, subscribe. I'm Madeline Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilience.